The winter of 1077 arrived in the Apennine Mountains with a vengeance that seemed almost biblical in its intensity. Snow fell not gently, but in relentless, sweeping curtains that blinded the eyes and froze the breath before it could fully leave the lungs. The passes leading south from Lombardy into Tuscany had become treacherous, then impassable, then deadly. Any sensible traveler had long since sought shelter behind stone walls, huddled near fires, waiting for spring to unlock the mountains. But the figure who approached the fortress of Canossa that January was not a sensible traveler. He was a desperate one. Henry IV, King of the Germans, King of Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor, had been marching for weeks under brutal conditions. Much of that army had indeed broken. Men deserted in the night. Pack animals died on the trails. Supplies ran low, then ran out. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to him now muttered curses behind his back, wondering if following this excommunicated king was their worst decision. But Henry pushed forward. He had no choice. The sequence of events that led him to this frozen hillside had unfolded with devastating speed. Months earlier, his conflict with Pope Gregory VII had reached its breaking point. The issue was authority. Who had the right to appoint bishops? Who controlled the spiritual offices that carried with them vast lands and political power? Gregory, a reformer who believed the church must be free from secular control, had answered decisively. Only the Pope, Henry, raised to believe that emperors ruled by divine right and that kings anointed by God did not answer to priests, had answered differently. The exchange of letters grew heated. Insults were traded. Then Henry escalated. He convened a council of German bishops. They declared Gregory deposed, and he wrote a letter addressing the Pope, not as Holy Father, but as Brother Hildebrand, a pointed reminder of Gregory's humble origins. The letter concluded with 3 words that echoed across Christendom. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, say to you, along with all my bishops, descend, descend, to be damned throughout the ages. Gregory's response was not what Henry expected. The Pope did not pack his belongings and slink quietly into retirement. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He excommunicated Henry. He declared the king cut off from the church, deprived of the sacraments, and released all his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. In the medieval mind, this was not symbolism. It was cosmic war. An excommunicated ruler could not legitimately govern. His commands carried no moral weight. His soul was in peril. And worst of all, his political opponents now had divine permission to move against him. The reaction was immediate. German princes who had long resented Henry's authority saw their opportunity. They gathered and issued an ultimatum. If Henry remained excommunicated past February, they would elect a new king. Henry faced total collapse. His dynasty, his throne, everything he had fought for, slipping away not through military defeat, but through papal ink. He had to reverse the excommunication before the deadline. He had to reach Gregory and make peace. But Gregory, knowing Henry's temper and his capacity for violence, had done something calculated. He had traveled north from Rome and placed himself under the protection of Matilda of Tuscany. And Matilda had received him at Canossa, her most formidable fortress, perched on a rocky spur in the Apennines, surrounded by walls that had never been breached. So Henry marched, through blizzards, through frozen rivers, through passes where men and horses slipped and fell, and sometimes did not rise again. He crossed the Alps at Mont Cenis, in conditions that later chroniclers described with horrified awe. Local guides led the way. Soldiers crawled on hands and knees. The queen and her ladies were wrapped in ox hides and dragged across the ice. Men died. Horses died, but Henry survived. And now, in the 3rd week of January, he stood outside the walls of Canossa, an emperor reduced to a supplicant. The fortress rose above him on its rocky height, walls pale against the dark mountain, towers silhouetted against the gray winter sky. Smoke rose from within. Guards paced the battlements. Behind those walls, warm and secure, sat the man who held Henry's fate in his hands. And behind those walls also sat Matilda, the woman who had made this moment possible, whose lands blocked the imperial path, whose loyalty to Gregory had never wavered, and whose castle now served as a stage for the most dramatic confrontation of the age. Henry did not approach with arrogance. He could not. He stripped away the symbols of his office. No crown, no royal robes, no visible reminders that he was, by birth and election, the most powerful secular ruler in Europe. He dressed instead in the coarse wool of a penitent, a simple tunic, bare feet, no cloak against the cold. And in that humiliating attire, he approached the fortress gates and asked for admission. Not as emperor, as a sinner seeking absolution. The gates did not open. Gregory, inside, was not moved by the spectacle. He had seen Henry's rages. He had read Henry's letters demanding his damnation. He knew that this humility was strategic, not spiritual. So he waited. He let the emperor stand outside, and Henry stood. The first day passed. Snow fell. Henry's bare feet turned numb, then white, then something worse. His companions, also barefoot, also penitent, huddled nearby, their suffering visible to the guards on the walls. Inside the castle, fires crackled. Food was served. Gregory prayed. Matilda watched, and still Henry stood. The second day passed. The cold did not relent. Frost formed on Henry's tunic. His lips cracked. His body shivered uncontrollably. Some of his companions collapsed and had to be carried away, but Henry remained. He stood at the gate, an image of such profound humility that even some inside the fortress began to question Gregory's resolve. How long could a pope refuse a penitent seeking reconciliation? How long before this spectacle became not a lesson in humility, but a scandal of hardness? Matilda moved between them. She had known Henry before the rupture. She understood the politics behind the drama. And she understood Gregory's caution. The Pope feared that forgiving Henry too quickly would be seen as weakness. That the emperor would use absolution as a political tool and then return to his old ways. But she also understood that allowing an emperor to freeze to death outside her gates would carry consequences of its own. She negotiated, she urged, she kept lines of communication open when both sides wanted to harden into permanent opposition. The third day arrived. Henry, barely standing, still waited. His feet were damaged. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse. The image had achieved what Henry needed. It was unforgettable. An emperor, the successor of Charlemagne, the ruler of Germany and Italy, standing barefoot in the snow, begging a priest for forgiveness. Whatever happened next, that image would echo through chronicles and sermons and political discourse for centuries. Finally, Gregory relented. The gates opened. Henry entered the fortress, still barefoot, still penitent, still stripped of every outward sign of power. He was led inside, out of the cold, into the presence of the Pope. And there, in the chapel of Canossa, watched by Matilda and her advisors, Henry knelt. He made his confession. He promised obedience. He swore to uphold the rights of the Church and to submit to papal judgment in the disputes with his German princes. And Gregory, in the name of Christ, lifted the excommunication. The immediate crisis was over. Henry was restored to communion. His throne, for the moment, was secure. But the longer conflict between empire and papacy was not resolved. It could not be resolved by one man kneeling in the snow. The issues of authority that had driven them apart remained unsettled. And Henry, once he had recovered his strength and returned to Germany, would remember this humiliation. He would never forgive Gregory for making him wait 3 days in the cold. He would never forgive Matilda for providing the stage on which his degradation was performed. The Peace of Canossa was not peace at all. It was a pause. But for 3 days in January 1077, the world watched an emperor stand barefoot in the snow outside a fortress in the Apennines. And the world understood something new. Spiritual authority, when wielded by someone who would not bend, could humble even the mightiest secular power. That lesson did not end the wars, but it changed how those wars were understood. And at the center of it all, not quite Pope, not quite Emperor, stood Matilda of Tuscany, whose castle had held the storm, whose mediation had shaped the outcome, and whose name would be forever linked to the most famous winter in medieval political history. The cold stone corridors of Canossa echoed with footsteps carrying the weight of Christendom. Matilda moved through her fortress with assurance, but her pace was measured, deliberate. She was the fulcrum upon which the balance of power between empire and papacy now rested. The siege of Canassa, if it could be called a siege, had entered its third day. Henry IV remained in the snow, a figure of theatrical humility. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere was tense, charged, fragmented. Henry's representatives huddled near the outer walls, waiting, hoping, freezing, and between them all moved Matilda, a constant presence. She was not a neutral party. Her loyalty to the reformed papacy was absolute. Gregory trusted her completely. Her territories offered security no Roman palace could match. When popes needed refuge, Matilda's castles stood open. This was not accidental. It was strategy built over decades. But loyalty did not mean blindness. Matilda saw what Gregory might miss. She saw that Henry's suffering outside the gates was not merely a spectacle. It was a weapon. Every hour the emperor stood barefoot. His humiliation deepened, but so did the moral pressure on Gregory. The Pope's refusal risked transforming him into a figure of implacable hardness. German princes had threatened to depose Henry if he remained excommunicated. The man who froze to death seeking forgiveness would become a martyr. Matilda understood narratives. She had grown up surrounded by them. Stories of her father's assassination, her mother's imprisonment, the endless struggle. She knew that what happened at Canassa would be told and retold, shaped and reshaped. Her task was to ensure the story reflected the principles for which she and Gregory fought. Spiritual authority, the independence of the church, could not be surrendered. So she moved. From Gregory's chambers to the outer halls. From the outer halls to the parapets, where she could look down at the frozen figure below. From the parapets back to Gregory's advisors, who debated fiercely. Matilda listened to all of them. She absorbed their arguments, their fears, their convictions. And then she spoke, her voice carrying weight because her actions carried weight. These men knew that Matilda commanded armies. They knew that her fortresses controlled the roads between Germany and Rome. Without her support, Gregory's position in Italy would crumble. When Matilda advised, when Matilda urged, they listened. Not because she was a woman, but because she was Matilda of Tuscany. She had never yet been wrong about when to hold firm and when to bend. The negotiations took place through intermediaries. Henry's representatives, hoarse from cold and desperation, pleaded for admission. They promised everything: obedience, submission, acceptance of papal judgment. Gregory remained skeptical. He had heard promises before. He knew that the emperor's current humility was political necessity, not spiritual transformation. The temptation to wait, to let the deadline expire, was real and powerful. Matilda did not dismiss that temptation. She understood its logic. But she also understood something Gregory might underestimate: the calculation of symbolism. If Gregory held out, the story would be one of implacability. A pope who let an emperor freeze rather than forgive. Matilda carried this argument to Gregory, not as a challenge, but as counsel. She spoke of what she had seen from the walls. The suffering was real. If the emperor lost toes, if he died, the political consequences would be unpredictable. The new king would inherit a story of papal cruelty that would poison relations for generations. Gregory listened. He trusted Matilda as he trusted few others. She had proven her loyalty through actions, through years of sheltering reform advocates. When she spoke of political reality, he knew she spoke from experience, not theory. When she warned of narrative consequences, he knew she understood how stories shape the world. The discussions stretched through the third day. Henry remained outside. Matilda moved between the factions, carrying messages, suggesting compromises, reminding everyone involved of what was at stake. Finally, Gregory made his decision. He would admit Henry. He would lift the excommunication, but on terms that preserved the moral high ground. Henry would swear obedience, submit to papal judgment, acknowledge mercy. Matilda ensured that the recording happened. She ensured that witnesses were present. When Henry finally entered the fortress, Matilda stood nearby, watching, calculating, because she knew, as Gregory knew, that this moment would not last. The underlying conflict remained unresolved. The issues of investiture, of authority. But for now, the immediate crisis had passed. Matilda would return to governing her territories, maintaining her fortresses, preparing for the next confrontation, because there would always be a next confrontation. The mediation at Canassa was not the end of anything. It was a pause, a breath, but it was also proof that Matilda of Tuscany occupied a position unlike any other figure. Not pope, not emperor, but indispensable to both. A woman whose counsel shaped the most powerful men in Christendom. A strategist who understood that battles are fought not with swords, but with words. Not on battlefields, but in corridors. Not through confrontation, but through patient work. The frozen days at Canassa passed into legend. Behind the legend, there was another image, less dramatic but equally important. Matilda, moving through her fortress, carrying messages, shaping outcomes, ensuring that when the gates finally opened, the church emerged with its principles intact. That image does not appear in every chronicle. It does not dominate every retelling. But for those who understand how power actually works, that image matters. Matilda at Canassa, mediating between Pope and Emperor, holding together what would otherwise have shattered. That is the story beneath the story. That is the history that rewards those who look past the spectacle to see the strategy. The plain outside, Sorbara lay quiet under the gray Italian sky, but the quiet was deceptive. It was the stillness of anticipation, of armies holding their breath, of men gripping weapons. The year was 1084, and the conflict that had simmered since Canassa had boiled over into open war. Henry IV, his throne secured, his humiliation at Canassa burned into his memory like a brand, had marched south again. This time, he came not as a penitent seeking forgiveness, but as an emperor seeking conquest. Rome was his target, and standing between him and his goal were the territories of Matilda of Tuscany, whose loyalty to Gregory never wavered. Matilda had not waited passively for the imperial advance. She had spent years preparing for this moment. Fortresses were reinforced, supply depots were established, alliances were renewed. When Henry's forces crossed into her lands, they found no easy conquest, no swift march toward Rome. They found a network of strongholds garrisoned by determined troops, a population loyal to their ruler. But Matilda also understood that defense alone could not win. The imperial advance had to be met. That point came at Sorbara, a modest settlement whose name would be remembered for what happened there. The imperial forces were formidable. Henry had assembled a coalition of supporters, German nobles and Italian lords. They outnumbered Matilda's forces significantly. They were veterans of campaigns across Europe. They expected victory. And they expected, perhaps, that Matilda's troops, commanded by a woman, would hesitate, waver, break. They were wrong. Matilda rode among her soldiers that morning, visible to as many as could see her. She wore armor. The metal was functional, designed for battle, not ceremony. Her horse was a war horse. She carried herself not as a noblewoman, observing from a safe distance, but as a commander. Chroniclers who recorded the battle noted the effect this had. Soldiers who might have doubted looked at their leader and saw someone who asked nothing she was not willing to give herself. That mattered. In the medieval world, where loyalty was often transactional, that mattered enormously. The battle unfolded across the fields outside Sorbara with the brutal, chaotic intensity that characterized medieval warfare. There was no elegant maneuvering, no sophisticated tactics of the kind later centuries would develop. There was instead the crash of cavalry, the shield wall grinding against shield wall, the screams of wounded men. Matilda's forces, though outnumbered, held because they believed in their cause. They held because the alternative was letting the imperial army pass unopposed toward Rome, toward the Pope. The fighting was fiercest around the standards. Banners marked where commanders were, where victory would be decided. Imperial forces pressed toward Matilda's standard, knowing that if they could reach it, the battle would end. Matilda's troops pressed back. The standard became a magnet for violence, drawing men into a vortex of killing. Matilda herself was in the thick of it, not because she was reckless, but because she understood that medieval warfare was fought as much with morale as with steel. A commander who stayed behind the lines could not inspire the kind of devotion that turned the tide. A commander who fought alongside, who bled alongside, could ask for extraordinary things, and Matilda needed extraordinary things that day. She needed men to stand when every instinct told them to flee. She needed men to advance when the enemy seemed unstoppable. She needed men to believe that victory was possible. The imperial forces, for all their advantages, had a weakness. They were a coalition. When the battle turned hard, when the easy victory they anticipated became a grinding struggle, that weakness emerged. Coordination faltered. Resolve wavered. Units found themselves isolated, uncertain, vulnerable. Matilda's forces, by contrast, were unified. They knew each other, they trusted each other, and they had the advantage of fighting on ground they knew, for a cause that mattered personally. The turning point came when Matilda's cavalry, held in reserve, struck the imperial flank. The timing was precise. The imperial forces, fully engaged, had no reserves left to meet this new threat. The charge hit them like a hammer, disrupting formations, sowing panic, transforming the fight into a rout. Imperial soldiers who had been confident of victory now fled for their lives, trampling comrades. The victory at Sorbara was complete. Matilda's forces had shattered the imperial advance. Henry's plans for a swift march on Rome lay in ruins. Casualties littered the fields. They had been defeated by a woman. They had been outfought, outmaneuvered, outlasted by Matilda of Tuscany. For some survivors, the shame of that admission was almost worse than the wounds they carried. But for everyone who heard the story, it was proof that Matilda was a military commander of genuine ability. The aftermath of Sorbara was as significant as the battle itself. Henry's campaign never fully recovered. Instead, it was Matilda who had momentum. Her name was spoken with respect, with fear, with admiration. It was Matilda who had demonstrated that the reformed papacy could defend itself through steel and courage. In the months and years that followed, Matilda continued to campaign, continued to defend her territories, but Sorbara remained the defining moment, the battle that proved what was possible. Chroniclers who wrote about the investiture controversy always returned to Sorbara. They described the outnumbered forces, the determined commander, the unexpected victory. They marveled that a woman could achieve what so many male commanders had failed to achieve. For Matilda herself, Sorbara was not an ending, but a confirmation. She had always known that her position required strength, willingness to fight, capacity to inspire men. The battle proved that she possessed those qualities in abundance. It also proved that imperial power was not invincible. Henry IV could be stopped, could be defeated, could be forced to reckon with the reality that Italy would not simply fall before him. The fields outside Sorbara, soaked with blood and littered with the dead, returned eventually to peace. But the memory did not fade. It lived in the stories told around fires, in the chronicles copied by scribes. And at the center of that memory, always, was the image of Matilda on horseback, armored, visible, leading her troops. That image, once established, never disappeared. It became part of her legend. Matilda at Sorbara, winning the battle that changed the war. That is what they remembered. That is what we still know. The room was quiet, and in giving, she secured something more durable than any conquest. She secured a legacy that would outlast empires. The morning of the feast day arrived with anticipation, transforming ordinary streets into something electric. The town of York, its cathedral rising against the sky, markets buzzing, prepared for a yearly event. It drew crowds from miles around, turning the entire city into a living stage. The mystery plays were coming, with massive wooden pageant wagons carrying heaven and hell through the streets. They brought scripture to life for those who could not read, transforming theology into spectacle and drama. The first wagon appeared at the edge of town as the sun cleared the walls, its wheels creaking. It was a two-tiered structure, larger than most homes, built to be seen from afar, carrying actors and props. The lower level served as a chaotic dressing room and storage, where costumes hung and props waited. The upper level was the stage, open to the sky, painted with backdrops suggesting palaces and wilderness. At the front, a painted facade announced which story this wagon would tell. The Plasterers' Guild was responsible for this first wagon, their episode, the creation of the world. It was an honor and a burden, opening the cycle, setting the tone for everything that followed. These craftsmen, who worked with lime and sand, were now the hands through which sacred history would be made visible. The wagon rolled through the streets, children running alongside, pointing at the painted heavens. William, a quiet plasterer, chosen for his deep voice, played God, wearing a robe of white and gold. He had rehearsed his lines until engraved in memory, his gestures natural, but performing before thousands was different. The first station was the square before the cathedral, where the largest crowds would gather. The wagon maneuvered into position, handlers leveling wheels and securing the structure with practiced efficiency. Curtains adjusted, props arranged, actors took their places, some hidden below, waiting for cues. The crowd pressed forward, a living sea of faces, eager to be transported to the dawn of creation. A trumpet sounded, a single clear note cutting through the murmur, bringing silence. Then the play began. God spoke, his voice carrying across the square, amplified by silence and collective will. In the beginning, I made heaven and earth, William declared, his deep voice rolling over the crowd. Light and darkness, land and sea, sun and moon, all that is seen and unseen. Angels appeared, boys from the guild dressed in white, their faces serious, movements careful. The crowd gasped at the sudden appearance of celestial beings, witnessing not a story, but an event. When the creation play concluded, the plasterers struck their set, preparing for the next performance. Behind them, the next wagon approached, belonging to the shipwrights, their massive ark constructed. The shipwrights' wagon was a marvel of engineering, as befitted the guild that built actual ships. The ark was a three-dimensional structure, large enough for actors, with a roof, windows, and a door. Animals, represented by children in costumes, waited below, ready to board 2 by 2. The crowd, having watched creation, now watched the flood approach with the same intensity. Noah's wife, played by a shipwright with a talent for comedy, refused to board. She had her own lines, her own perspective, her own reasons for not wanting to leave everything behind. The crowd laughed at her stubbornness, her practical objections, her refusal while Noah pleaded. They understood that faith was not always easy, that following God sometimes meant leaving the familiar. The laughter enhanced the message, making Noah's wife human, the story accessible. This was not distant theology. It was a husband and wife arguing about a major life decision. The wagons continued through the day, each guild taking its turn, each episode building upon the last. The bakers presented the Last Supper, their stage set with a table, bread, and wine. There, Christ broke the loaf with solemn dignity, a powerful moment. The butchers, given the crucifixion, faced the challenge of portraying violence without actual brutality. They succeeded through staging, music, and the anguished expressions of actors handling something sacred. The crowd followed, moving from station to station, watching creation, fall, flood, and covenant. They watched Moses receive the law, David defeat Goliath, Isaiah foretell, and Jeremiah lament. Children who could not read learned scripture through these performances. Adults saw stories anew, embodied by neighbors and tradesmen they knew. The distance between sacred and ordinary collapsed. Heaven was here, on this wagon, in this square. As the sun descended, the final wagon approached, the most anticipated, the Last Judgment. The crowd's mood shifted, laughter faded, conversations died, even children grew quiet. The wagon of the Last Judgment was the most elaborate. Heaven was elevated, Christ enthroned. Hell was below, its famous mouth gaping wide, painted with fangs and flames, smoke curling. The dead rose from graves, actors emerging through trapdoors, faces painted with pallor. The saved were guided gently toward heaven, their expressions hopeful, hands reaching for light. The damned were seized by devils, dragged toward the Hellmouth, their screams echoing. The crowd watched in silence. This was not entertainment. It was warning, promise, threat, hope. They saw themselves in the faces of the saved and the damned, wondering which they would be. The devils, once comic, now inspired genuine fear, their capering replaced by menace. The play concluded. Christ spoke final words. Separation complete. Angels sang. Devils retreated. The wagon fell silent, and the crowd dispersed into the gathering dusk, carrying images and emotions. The mystery plays did not end when the wagons stopped rolling. They continued in memory. The plasterer, who played God, returned to his workshop, carrying the echo of his voice, speaking creation. The shipwright, who played Noah's wife, carried the crowd's laughter and the knowledge he made them think. The crowd returned home, carrying the story of salvation, made visible, audible, unforgettable. The pageant wagons rolled back to guild halls, to be repaired, repainted, waiting for next year. The great cathedral stood silent in darkness, its stones witnessing the faith that moved through streets. The mystery plays were over for another year, but their work continued in every heart that believed. The Guildhall hummed with activity, though not the kind of activity that usually filled its space. The carpenters who gathered here were not planning their next building project or dividing up the latest contract for timber framing. They were building something altogether different. Something that would not stand for centuries or shelter families from the weather. Something that would exist for a single day and then be dismantled, stored, and rebuilt again next year. They were building eternity, or at least their craft's best approximation of it, and they approached the task with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. The Hellmouth dominated the center of the workshop, its massive frame taking shape under dozens of hands. It was a monster, a construction of wood and canvas and paint that would become the most memorable image in the entire mystery play cycle. When it was finished, when it was mounted on the pageant wagon and rolled through the streets of York, it would terrify children, thrill adults, and remind everyone who saw it that the consequences of sin were not abstract theological concepts, but visceral, immediate, terrifying realities. The carpenters understood this. They understood that they were not merely building a prop. They were building a symbol, a warning, a vision of damnation that would sear itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The design was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. The Hellmouth was exactly what its name suggested, a gigantic mouth, large enough for several actors to pass through at once, its jaws gaping wide to receive the damned. The lower jaw extended forward, creating a stage within the stage where devils could caper and souls could writhe. The upper jaw arched overhead, lined with painted teeth the size of a man's arm, stained red and yellow to suggest the fires within. Behind the mouth, canvas painted to resemble flames would ripple and flutter, animated by hidden assistants who could make the fires seem to dance. Smoke would pour from the depths, created by burning materials carefully controlled to produce effect without danger. The carpenters worked with the precision their craft demanded. Joints were fitted tightly, ensuring that the structure would survive the rough handling of transport and performance. Supports were reinforced, guaranteeing that the weight of actors and the stress of movement would not cause collapse. Surfaces were smoothed, preparing them for the painters who would transform raw wood into nightmare. Every detail mattered because every detail would be seen, would be remembered, would contribute to the overwhelming impression the Hellmouth was designed to create. Nearby, the painters waited for their turn at the structure. They had already prepared their materials, pigments ground and mixed, brushes cleaned and sorted. Samples of their previous work displayed on the walls of the Guildhall. They were proud of their craft, as proud as the carpenters, as proud as any of the trades that contributed to the mystery plays. They knew that their work would be what people remembered, the colors and images that would linger in memory long after the plays ended. The Hellmouth needed to be terrifying, and terror, they understood, was largely a matter of color and line. When the carpenters finally stepped back, satisfied that the structure was sound, the painters moved forward with their brushes and pots. They worked quickly, but carefully, applying base colors that would provide foundation for the details to come. Red for the interior, the color of fire and blood and the heat of damnation. Yellow for the highlights, suggesting flames that never died. Black for the depths, for the darkness that waited beyond the fire, for the nothingness that was the final destination of souls cut off from God. They painted teeth in alternating shades, making them seem sharp and irregular, the teeth of a predator that had evolved specifically to consume the damned. The detail work took days. The painters added texture to the flames, making them seem to flicker even in stillness. They highlighted the teeth, giving them dimension and menace. They painted souls and torment on the interior walls, tiny figures writhing in the fire, their faces twisted with agony that the audience would barely glimpse but would somehow sense. They added the figures of devils around the edges, leering faces and grasping hands that suggested the demons who would emerge from this mouth to drag the unwary into damnation. While the painters worked, other craftsmen prepared the mechanisms that would bring the Hellmouth to life. Trapdoors were installed in the floor of the pageant wagon, allowing actors to emerge from below as if rising from the depths. Smoke pots were positioned behind the structure, their locations carefully chosen to maximize visual effect while minimizing risk to actors and audience. Ropes and pulleys were rigged to allow the jaws to move, to open wider or close slightly, to give the impression of a living thing, a monster that was hungry and waiting. The blacksmith contributed chains and shackles, real iron that would clank and rattle as devils dragged souls toward damnation. The sound was important, they all understood. The visual impact of the Hellmouth was primary, but the total effect required more than sight. It required sound, the clanking of chains, the crackle of fire, the screams of the damned. It required smell, the smoke that would drift across the square, carrying with it the suggestion of burning. It required the full engagement of the senses, the complete immersion of the audience in the reality of judgment. As the days passed and the work continued, the Hellmouth took on a presence that went beyond its physical components. It dominated the guild hall, looming over everything, watching with its empty jaws, waiting for the moment when it would come to life. The craftsmen who worked on it found themselves speaking more quietly in its presence, found themselves glancing at it as they left for the day, found themselves dreaming of its teeth and flames. They were building something that was meant to inspire fear, and they were not immune to their own creation. The final stages of construction involved testing. The jaws were opened and closed repeatedly, ensuring that the mechanisms worked smoothly. Smoke pots were ignited, their output adjusted to produce the right amount without overwhelming the actors. Actors climbed through the mouth, emerging from the depths, practicing their movements, learning how to use the space. Devils capered on the lower jaw, reaching for souls, shouting their lines, creating the chaos that would terrify and delight the crowds. The damned were dragged through, screaming appropriately, disappearing into the painted flames. Everything had to work perfectly because there would be no second chances on performance day. The Hellmouth would appear once, would do its work, would be remembered. If something failed, if a jaw jammed or a smoke pot malfunctioned or an actor fell, there would be no opportunity to correct. The audience would see what they saw, and the memory would be fixed. The craftsmen understood this pressure, accepted it, built against it with every joint they tightened and every mechanism they tested. When the Hellmouth was finally complete, when the carpenters and painters and blacksmiths and riggers had all done their work, they gathered to look at what they had made. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was exactly what they had intended. The mouth gaped wide, its teeth gleaming, its flames flickering even in stillness. The devils painted on its surface seemed to move in the changing light. The smoke pots, tested one last time, produced clouds that curled from the depths and drifted upward, carrying with them the smell of sulfur and the suggestion of damnation. The guild members stood in silence, looking at their creation. They were not theologians. They were not priests or monks or scholars. They were craftsmen, men who worked with their hands, who measured and cut and painted and built. But in this moment, they understood something profound. They had made visible what they believed. They had given form to the warnings they heard in church, the threats of judgment that punctuated every sermon. They had built a Hellmouth that would terrify their neighbors, their children, themselves, and in that terror, they had created something real. On performance day, the Hellmouth was carefully loaded onto its pageant wagon, secured against the jostling of transport, covered with cloths to preserve the surprise. The wagon joined the procession of other wagons, each carrying its own portion of sacred history, each representing the work of a different guild. The carpenters walked beside their creation, proud and nervous, knowing that within hours, thousands of people would see what they had built. The painters walked with them, their eyes on the covered structure, imagining the moment when the cloths would fall away and the crowd would gasp. The procession moved through the streets of York, gathering followers as it went. Children ran alongside, trying to glimpse what was hidden. Adults pointed and speculated, knowing that the Last Judgment wagon was always the most elaborate, always the most terrifying. always the one that lingered in memory. The carpenters and painters heard the comments, the anticipation, the fear. They exchanged glances, but said nothing. They would let their work speak for itself. When the final station arrived, when the last judgment wagon rolled into place and the crowd pressed forward, the moment came. The cloths were pulled away. The Hellmouth was revealed, and for a single breath, there was silence. Then the gasps began, the cries of children, the muttered prayers of adults. The Hellmouth gaped before them, teeth gleaming, flames painted, smoke already beginning to curl from its depths. It was real. It was terrifying. It was exactly what the craftsmen had intended. The devils emerged, climbing from the jaws, capering on the lower lip, reaching for the crowd with painted claws. The damned were dragged forward, screaming, pleading, disappearing into the flames. The smoke thickened, the chains rattled. The crowd watched in terror and wonder, understanding, in a way they had never understood before, that the consequences of sin were not distant threats, but immediate realities, that hell was not a theological abstraction, but a place, a mouth, a hunger that waited for the unwary. The carpenters and painters watched from the edges of the crowd, watching their creation do its work. They saw the fear in the faces around them. They heard the prayers. They felt the weight of what they had made. And in that moment, they understood that they had done something more than build a prop. They had built a vision of eternity. They had made damnation visible. They had given their community a memory that would last forever, a memory of teeth and flames and the hunger of hell. When the play ended, when the last soul had been judged and the last devil had retreated into the smoke, the Hellmouth fell silent. The crowd dispersed, carrying their terror and their prayers into the streets of York. The carpenters and painters approached their creation, checking for damage, preparing for the long process of cleaning and storage. The Hellmouth had done its work. It would do it again next year, and the year after that, and for as long as the mystery plays continued. But for now, it was finished, quiet, waiting, and the craftsmen who had built it looked at it one last time before covering it again. Proud of what they had made, grateful that they would not have to face it themselves.